Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, depending on where we're logging in from today. My name is David Lviv, and I am a campus advisor for Camera on Campus. I'm excited to welcome you all to this event as we're about to get started with this amazing and important conversation regarding Jewish and pro-Israel activism in the legal space. Before we begin our event, I would just like to remind people that Camera on Campus is a nonpartisan organization that fosters conversations based on the facts, and this also applies to our Q&A. When you have a chance to submit Q&A, which will be used from the Q&A function, you'll be allowed to ask any question you'd like, but it's important to note that we'll be answering questions that fit Camera's nonpartisan mission regarding all topics that are discussed today. So I want to thank you in advance for abiding by that. I will be introducing our student fellow, Avi, who will be leading this discussion, and he has done an amazing job preparing this event and thinking about the important conversations we'll have at this event. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Avi from York University.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event. I'm excited. After quite a lot of effort and a lot of excitement, we present President of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law and the co-founder and partner of Lewin & Lewin LLP, Miss Alyza Lewin. Welcome, Alyza.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, David and Camera, for inviting me to join you today for this program. As you mentioned, I'm president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, and in that capacity, I hear nearly each and every day from students who are experiencing anti-Semitism. These students are being told directly, and sometimes indirectly, that if they want to be accepted on campus, if they want to be included and join progressive clubs, social justice demonstrations, or even engage in dialogue, they must first shed their sense of Jewish peoplehood, abandon their ethnic pride, and disavow the Jews' ancestral indigenous connection to the land of Israel. Students today who express support for Israel as a Jewish homeland are being demonized and excluded. This is anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. So why is it permitted? Why doesn't the world recognize this anti-Semitism? In a world that opposes bigotry, why is there no resounding chorus condemning this discrimination? The unfortunate answer is that although anti-Semitism is society's oldest hatred, much of society today does not understand what anti-Semitism even is. Many people who think they understand anti-Semitism only recognize as anti-Semitic the anti-Semitism that resembles the Holocaust. If they see a swastika, for example, or they hear a Nazi or a white supremacist, they know that is anti-Semitic. Or if they learn that someone who is identifiably Jewish, such as a man with side curls, peyot, or a yarmulke, was stabbed, or worshipers at a synagogue were attacked, they may also recognize that as anti-Semitic. A disturbing recent study, though, suggests that 2/3 of young adults today don't know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So the number of individuals who are able to recognize even the anti-Semitism that resembles the Holocaust may be dwindling. But of those who are at least somewhat knowledgeable about the Holocaust, many don't understand that anti-Semitism not only caused the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism existed for centuries before the Holocaust. They don't appreciate that anti-Semitism looks a little different in each generation. Anti-Semitism morphs. The one constant is that anti-Semitism always seeks to pin whatever it is that's that generation's greatest evil on the Jew. Because anti-Semitism always seeks to demonize, marginalize, ostracize, exclude, and cancel the Jew. Historically, Jews were maligned as the Christ killers, or during the Black Death, Jews were blamed as the source of the bubonic plague. For socialists, the Jews were the capitalists. For capitalists, the Jews were the socialists. For the Nazis, who sought a pure Aryan race, the Jews were the ultimate race polluters. Whatever each generation finds most appalling, whatever that society views as its greatest evil, that is pinned on the Jew. The Jew is demonized. Anti-Semites target the Jews as the source of the problem. The Jew is blamed for society's misfortune and for all that is bad. The implication is that if only the Jews would disappear, the world would be a better place. So what is today's current evil? What is the issue that has upended our society and led to riots here in the United States? Racism, apartheid, settler colonialism. And lo and behold, who is it that society has deemed the greatest offender of these evils? Not just individual Jews, but the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel, the one and only true democracy in the Middle East, the one place in that region of the world where all faiths, all races, all ethnicities, all genders are equal under the law. That one country, the Jewish homeland, is singled out and demonized. That is today's anti-Semitism. But much of society today does not yet comprehend that as contemporary anti-Semitism. Irwin Cutler, and those who are from Canada on this call will recognize that name for sure. He was the former Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, and he's a renowned human rights activist. He once said, and I paraphrase, "Traditional anti-Semitism sought to marginalize and ostracize the individual Jew and deny him a place in society. Today's anti-Semitism seeks to marginalize and demonize the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel, and deny it its place in the society of nations." So our first challenge is that much of society doesn't understand what anti-Semitism is. They can't recognize it. A second miscomprehension that makes it difficult to combat anti-Semitism today is that most people are either unable or perhaps unwilling to distinguish between a discussion of Israel's policies on the one hand and statements of support for the Jewish homeland that are, for many Jews, an expression of their pride in their Jewish ethnic identity on the other. Judaism is both a faith and an ethnicity. Jews share not only religious traditions, but also a deep historical sense of Jewish peoplehood. The Jews' history, theology, and culture are deeply intertwined with the land of Israel. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but over half of the 613 commandments in the Pentateuch are related to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel. For centuries, Jews have not only prayed facing Jerusalem, they've prayed to return to Jerusalem. Zionism as a political movement of the Jewish people may have originated in the 19th century, but the desire and determination of Jews to return to their ancestral homeland in Israel, that's thousands of years old as Abraham, Moses, and the children of Israel's exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. Zionism is as integral to Judaism as observing the Jewish Sabbath or maintaining a kosher diet. Of course, not all Jews observe the Sabbath or keep kosher, but those who do are clearly expressing important components of their Jewish identity. Similarly, not all Jews are Zionists. But for many Jews, identifying with and expressing support for the Jewish homeland is also a sincere and deeply felt expression of their Jewish religious and ethnic identity. When Jews express pride in the fact that there is a country where the national calendar is the Jewish calendar, so they don't have to take vacation days to celebrate the religious holidays, or students don't have to worry that they may have an exam on Yom Kippur or on Shavuot, when Jews are excited that there's a country where kosher food is easily available, or where the ancient Jewish language of Hebrew is the spoken language, and where Jews are free to practice their faith with pride, where Jewish culture is flourishing, where one can walk on stones that are the same stones that the ancient Jewish people walked on 3,000 years ago, that and those are examples of Jews celebrating their shared ancestry and ethnicity. It's not necessarily a statement of support for the political policies of the current government of Israel, and it's not a statement that suggests dual loyalty. Yet today on campuses and beyond, Jews who express this support for a Jewish homeland, Jews who take pride in the accomplishments of the Jewish people and who celebrate all that the Jewish collective, the Jewish nation state of Israel, contributes to the world in high tech and agriculture, medicine, art, science, and more, they're being branded as racist Zionists, as supporters of apartheid, and as settler colonialists. These are all categories that are considered this generation's greatest evil. Today, Jews are repeatedly told that if they want to be good citizens of the world, if they want to march for civil or human rights, they must first abandon their sense of Jewish peoplehood and ethnic pride. They have to shed this part of their Jewish identity and disavow the Jewish homeland. Demanding that Jews shed any part of their identity as the price for admission is discriminatory and anti-Semitic. It's comparable to demanding that a Catholic student disavow the Vatican or a Muslim student reject his or her connection to Mecca. Excluding an individual on the basis of his or her ancestral and ethnic identity is a form of national origin discrimination. And since I know we have some Canadians watching today, in Canada, it's referred to in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as national or ethnic origin discrimination. Discriminating against Jews in this fashion is another example of contemporary anti-Semitism. Let me just take a minute to talk about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. Combating anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish cause, it's a global human rights issue. Anti-Semitism undermines democratic values of respect, inclusion, and equality. It's a cancer that rots away at and decays and ultimately destroys societies that fail to curb it. But it's not possible to effectively combat this enemy if we refuse to define it. That is why we need the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition, the Ihra definition of anti-Semitism. The Ihra definition and its incorporated examples of contemporary anti-Semitism is a key educational tool because it teaches the public how to recognize anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations. The definition's examples demonstrate that anti-Semitism comes from both the right and the left. It utilizes traditional anti-Semitic tropes to demonize not only individual Jews, but also the Jewish collective, the State of Israel. And anti-Semitism seeks to deny Jews rights to which all human beings are entitled, including the right to equal opportunity regardless of national or ethnic identity. Utilizing the Ihra definition as a guide does not mean squelching criticism of the policies of the government of Israel. In fact, the Ihra definition explicitly states that, and I quote, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. The Ihra definition does not prohibit anti-Semitic speech, it merely labels as anti-Semitic the attacks that utilize traditional anti-Semitic tropes or that demonize, delegitimize, or apply a double standard to the Jewish homeland. It's important that universities adopt the Ihra definition, including the examples. Those who oppose this adoption are, quite frankly, anti-Semites who don't want to be labeled as anti-Semites. They want to preach anti-Semitism but not be canceled as racist Jew haters. There's one more point that students and the general public should understand before we turn to the legal remedies and explain how the law can be utilized to protect Jewish students. And that is, denying Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is qualitatively different than criticizing the policies of the government of Israel. Denying the right of Jewish self-determination is anti-Semitic not only because those who deny this right apply a double standard to the Jews. They support self-determination for all other groups, including Palestinians and Kurds, but deny it only to the Jews. It's also anti-Semitic because, as we've just been discussing, it demands that Jews shed a key component of their identity as Jews, namely the historic Jewish yearning and determination to return to Zion. I once heard Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, give the following analogy. He said, if a couple has a conversation about whether or not they should have children, whether they can afford children, whether they have the disposition to be good parents, that conversation is legitimate before the couple has any kids. After the children are born, that discussion becomes immoral. Similarly, 75 years ago, before the modern state of Israel was born, it was legitimate to have conversations, as many did, about whether or not a Jewish state should be established, particularly if that state would have to live by the sword and engage in the dirty business of statehood. Today, however, to suggest that the Jewish state of Israel has no right to exist is immoral and anti-Semitic. It's immoral because supporting the destruction of the world's only Jewish nation state is akin to supporting the destruction of Jews. Denying the right of Jewish self-determination means supporting the destruction of the safety net for Jews who are and have historically been persecuted around the globe. When people on campus and beyond say they're merely criticizing the policies of the government of Israel, we have to know where they stand on Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Because criticism of Israel by those who deny Jews the right of self-determination and who say Jews do not have a right to a Jewish homeland in any borders in the land of Israel is anti-Semitic, even if it's cloaked in human rights terminology. If you do not believe the Jewish state of Israel has a right to exist, your criticism of Israel is not intended to reform the policies of the government of Israel. It's not intended to be constructive. Rather, it's intended to be destructive and destroy the Jewish state. So now a quick word on legal remedies. What we're witnessing on campus and beyond today is not a free speech issue. It's the result of an organized, well-funded strategy to harass and marginalize Jewish and pro-Israel students and deny them a place in society. There are laws in the United States and Canada designed to protect individuals from harassment and discrimination. In the United States, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires universities to protect students from harassment and discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. In Canada, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Human Rights Act similarly afford protection to individuals who have been discriminated against on the basis of national or ethnic origin, among other categories. If students feel that they're being discriminated against, marginalized, and excluded on the basis of their shared ancestry or ethnicity, or on the basis of their identity as Jews, in the United States, they can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. The Office of Civil Rights, shorthand is known as OCR. OCR will then conduct an investigation. If OCR finds that the university was aware of the discrimination and did not take adequate steps to address it, then OCR could withhold federal funds from the university. In practice, that rarely happens. Usually, OCR negotiates a resolution with the university where the university agrees to take steps to address the discrimination. I'm not a Canadian attorney, but it appears to me that Canadian students might be able to file similar complaints with one of the provincial human rights commissions or perhaps even with the Canadian Federal Human Rights Commission. Most important for all students is to document. Documentation is key. Students have to learn to document both the anti-Semitic speech and the discriminatory conduct. You need to document the speech in order to make the university aware of the anti-Semitic speech so that the university can respond to that anti-Semitic speech with its own speech, so that it can explain how that runs counter to the values of the university of mutual respect and inclusion, and can educate the community, the university community, on why this is an example of anti-Semitism. So make the university aware of the anti-Semitic speech, so that they can condemn it the same way that they would condemn racist or bigoted speech. But don't stop there. Explain to the university how you are being marginalized and excluded. Are you being shut out of a student group or a campus event? Is your program being disrupted? Are you being told you're not welcome? Are you afraid to wear a yarmulke, a Star of David, or a t-shirt with Hebrew lettering because you're afraid that if you do, you will be targeted and maligned? That documentation is crucial to proving the harassment and discrimination that's currently taking place on many campuses. In addition, you should feel free to contact us at the Brandeis Center for help. We have attorneys and a trained group of law school students, our Jigsaw Fellows. That's our Justice Initiative Guiding Student Activists Worldwide, Jigsaw. They're available to work with you, to help you as you prepare talking points for meetings with administrators or other students, and to help you draft bias complaints when appropriate. If you're experiencing anti-Semitic harassment on campus, you can send us an email at info@brandeiscenter.com, and we will help put you in touch with someone who can assist you. And finally, you should always remember that the best response to unlawful discrimination is self-confidence and pride. Don't let anyone ever take that away from you. Jews have a deep, rich, profound heritage. study it, embrace it, and be proud of it. The Jewish people and the Jewish nation state of Israel have made enormous contributions to society in all these different areas, right? We have so much to be proud of. Imagine for just a moment if Israel had no enemies, nobody committed to its destruction. Imagine if Jews were no longer demonized. Israel would not have to spend any time or resources on security and defense. It would be able to devote 100% of its resources to improving the world in which we live. So we have to push back together against those who pressure Jews to disavow our ancestral and ethnic heritage, our Zionism. No one has a right to demand that we give up our sense of Jewish peoplehood, our historic yearning for Zion, or any part of our identity as Jews. Whether you are Ashkenazi, Sfaradi, Mizrahi, a Jew of color, conservative, Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, Haredi, Chiloni, we are all Jews, and Israel is our homeland. If we remember that, it will give us not only the strength to endure, but it will enable us to thrive despite the prejudice and hate. I'm happy to take questions. Look forward to our conversation, Avi, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Louis Brandeis Center for all the work you guys do. Are there any initiatives we should know about right now from either your law firm or from the Brandeis Center that besides your fellowship?
Well, the main one for students is the Jigsaw Fellowship. I will tell you, and I don't know if you have even law students also who may be watching, so I'll explain it a little bit more. What we did is we developed a curriculum to teach law school students the areas of law you really need to understand in order to effectively combat the anti-Semitism on campus. So they learn about the civil rights laws, anti-discrimination laws, First Amendment, principles of academic freedom, all of these issues so that they can be available, one, because they're on campus, two, because quite frankly, I think that sometimes talking to lawyers, particularly for undergraduates, can be a little bit intimidating. And so these law students are available to work with and help guide and advise the undergraduates as they confront any of these challenges on campus. We've been developing this in the United States. Actually, one of the things that I've been approached to see is if we could try and expand this even in Canada as well. So that's one initiative. And then out of those relationships, actually, clearly has grown the guidance and advice that we provide to students on campus. And we end up working with the students and we advise them whether it is helping them with talking points if they're going in for meetings with advisors, filing complaints if necessary, and that would include Title VI complaints with the Office of Civil Rights.
I wanted to ask you, because I'm in Canada, but I did for a while go to school in the US as well. I found that a lot of the OCR departments, both here in Canada, in the States, they make it very, very difficult to actually file the complaints if you're a Jewish student and have faced some sort of discrimination. Is there any way to put legal pressure on these departments, either through sanctions or through Title VI, or even outside lawsuits that would affect the ability, like, would help the process go forward? Because unfortunately, a lot of these departments seem to be staffed with people who aren't very inimical to Jewish students and aren't very supportive in the first place.
So are you, when you're talking about departments, are you talking about the within the universities that are the administrators that are tasked with reviewing this, or are you talking about government agencies when you ask that question?
Well, in Canada, they're one and the same. All Canadian universities are government run by definition. They're provincially run. But for example, I was told when I went to complain about like a blatantly anti-Semitic incident that the bar for me was set so high. I would need the person's like name, his student number. I'd need proof that he did it. And of course, none of the people in the room who were all his friends are gonna, vouch for me. So for some reason, the slightest insult to other minority groups on campus gets taken very seriously. But somehow for Jews, the bar seems to be set so high that no complaint can ever get processed. So, and I don't know exactly how it would work. Maybe it's not true in every US school, but I do know that there have been, some of my friends have complained about this as well, where, if you insult a person of color or a trans person, right? That the thing will be, your life will end until you can prove otherwise. But if an anti-Semitic incident like threatens you even physically, a Jewish student trying to prosecute that through an OCR department is blocked at every turn. And so Title VI would seem to be help, except we can't get anything through there.
So I think there is a distinction here based on what I'm hearing from you between Canada and the United States. And let me speak first about the United States, because that's what I'm familiar with. So in the United States, I think what you're saying, what these students are saying, is that when they go, for instance, to their diversity, equity, and inclusion divisions, whoever that dean is, dean of students or student life, who's supposed to be investigating this, or whatever group is supposed to be looking into bias complaints within the university, that's the hurdle. And exactly right, that anti-Semitism is not being treated the same as other forms of bigotry or racism, and it seems to be a very high standard. And so that's where the Office of Civil Rights, when you say OCR, that usually is referred to the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And so that's the federal agency, not in the university itself. And what happens is, if there is, as you've described, this failure to protect the students to the point where those students are experiencing the harassment has gotten so bad, right, so severe, persistent, pervasive, that they're now being excluded from equal opportunities on the campus. They're actually being pushed out of organizations, student government, committees. They're being told, literally, Zionists are not welcome on our campus, right? And when that happens, if the university doesn't take steps to ensure that the Jewish students are able to live and thrive and participate fully on campus with their full identity, right? That's the point at which the Office of Civil Rights clearly can and should be stepping in to say to the university, wait a minute, you have not satisfied your obligations under this law. So that's when, when you have situations like that happen on campus, you can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. Filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, technically, right, is not very difficult. In fact, there is in the United States an online form, and anybody can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. You do not even have to be a student. You don't have to be the person who experienced the harassment, yourself, to file the complaint. Somebody else, somebody not even on that campus who reads about it, who observes it, who thinks that it is discriminatory, could file that complaint. That happened actually last year at Williams College. There were a group of pro-Israel students who wanted to start an Israel, culture club and a pro-Israel group on campus, and they set off, they checked off, all the requirements in order to become a recognized student organization. But when it came to the student government having to vote to approve them, the anti-Israel forces on the student government said, "What? Like a pro-Israel, that racist, enterprise? We're not going to approve this club." And so purely on the Zionist basis of this club, right, the pro-Israel basis, they were denied. The person who filed that complaint with OCR was a law professor at George Mason, right? I mean, it was not somebody from the university. So anybody can actually file the Title VI complaints. And then what happens is the Office of Civil Rights first reviews the complaint to determine whether or not there's a basis there to open it. Then they open it if they find that there's sufficient basis to open it. And then they do a full investigation. And what's happened as a result of several of these investigations now, particularly ever since President Trump's executive order, and we can talk a little bit about Title VI and the executive order and how those connect. But what's happened is recognizing, as I said, that national origin discrimination against Jews includes this type of discrimination, discriminating against them for expressing and celebrating their shared ancestry and ethnicity. So the Office of Civil Rights has ended up entering resolution agreements, not just an agreement with Williams College, but they had an agreement with Duke. They had an agreement with UNC, that's North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and most recently with NYU. And the NYU resolution agreement required the university to adopt the Ihra definition, It required them to modify their own anti-discrimination policies to include the Ihra definition, to then institute training on anti-Semitism, to create essentially town hall opportunities for students who are feeling targeted by this kind of discrimination, to have an open, to enable them to have an open line of communication directly with the administration on this. And then there's continued monitoring from the Office of Civil Rights. But these are just some of the steps that that OCR can implement and put into place.
So I have a follow-up question to that, which is, are there any legal remedies on a personal basis? Could someone in the States, for example, sue if for example, I have a friend who was thrown down a stairwell in her university because she was the president of her Israel club. Is there, for example, criminal or I forget the other term. How is it called? Civil damages that you can seek from the university for not addressing the anti-Semitic campus climate?
So each case, you would evaluate it based on its own set of facts. It's conceivable that you might be able to demonstrate, pushing somebody down a steps is a tort. It's an assault, right? It's a assault, battery. The question is, the entire picture, and then weighing the challenges of mounting a full legal action in court. But there could conceivably be a legal basis depending upon what the discrimination or what the harassment or what, if it's a physical assault, sure. Look, if it's a physical assault or even vandalism, things like that should be reported to the police, right? One of the things that we did at the Brandeis Center actually also is we went through and did a review of the laws in all 50 states when it came to what I would call egregious event disruptions, right? When there are groups that come in deliberately intending with no purpose other than to shut down the pro-Israel events. And the truth is that there is, at least in the United States, pretty much in almost every one of the 50 states, some law on the book that makes that illegal. In most cases, it's a misdemeanor offense. Some places, I'll admit, it's even less than that. It's akin to a parking ticket. But the truth of the matter is students ought to learn that if this happens to them, they shouldn't hesitate to go to the police and report it. Because these offenders, especially if they're repeat offenders, they ought to start racking up those tickets, right? They ought to start racking up. And we did that. We advised a couple of years ago at UCLA, there was a terrible event disruption. It was a program on indigenous people, and groups had posted on social media beforehand, calling on people to come and deliberately shut down the event. And the students did go in. They had videotapes, so they had pictures of who the disruptors were. They were shouting for over 8 minutes, I think. And they ended up being prosecuted. There was, it was, what happened in the end was that the prosecutor ended up, because it was a first-time offense and a misdemeanor offense, so he essentially gave them, there's a proceeding by which the prosecutor can kind of give you a warning, and they ended up with this formal warning as opposed to a full trial. But that warning meant that if they ever did it again, they would be prosecuted at trial for both the new event and the old event, so the punishment would have been higher. And it deterred them. We didn't have a repeat situation.
Okay. My second question is, does the IHRA definition have any legal weight? Because it sounds like it's an important tool for education, like you said. But for example, the provincial government here in Canada just adopted it legally. But if a university adopts it, could it come up against, for example, First Amendment issues, or what kind of weight does this give Israelis or Jewish students in backing up sort of their claims and their issues?
So let's talk a little bit first about like what the executive order did in terms of linking the Ihra definition, and then we can talk about how the Ihra definition gets used. So in the United States, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says that entities that receive public government funds may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. It's interesting because religion is not a protected category under Title VI. And that was deliberate when the act was passed in 1964, in part because there were religious institutions that wanted to make sure that they would still have the ability to restrict their hiring to members of their own faith, particularly if they're teaching faith. So religion was left out. But then that created an issue, particularly after 9/11, when there was in educational environments, in universities and in schools, quite a bit of bullying of members of religious groups. Muslims, Sikhs who were being mistaken for Muslims suffered tremendous bullying in schools after 9/11. And one of the questions that came up was, will the Department of Education, do they have the jurisdiction to review the complaints that come to them if the people who are complaining are members of these religious groups? Or is this considered religious discrimination and something that the Office of Civil Rights doesn't have jurisdiction over? Ken Marcus, who is the founder of the Brandeis Center, this is actually before he founded it, he served his first stint. He was the acting head of the Office of Civil Rights back in 2004. He recently just finished a second time around running that office, but this was back in 2004. And he, at that time, wrote a Dear Colleague letter, which said, of course these students are protected because they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestral or ethnic characteristics, which is essentially national origin discrimination, which is one of the categories. And so he said, if you have groups that are being targeted and harassed and discriminated against on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, then they don't lose that protection just because they also share a common faith. And he wrote this Dear Colleague letter then and made it clear that that's how Title VI of the Civil Rights Act covers and encompasses and protects religious groups like Jews and Sikhs and Muslims. That's in 2004. In 2010, so 2004 is the Obama administration, a Republican administration. In 2010, President Obama's administration, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, adopted this same understanding of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And they actually issued their own Dear Colleague letter that quoted heavily from Ken Marcus's 2004 letter. And the Department of Education in 2010 issued a letter with guidance on how schools and universities could address this type of national origin discrimination. So by 2010, you already had essentially bipartisan agreement, right? Both a Republican and a Democratic administration that had said Title VI of the Civil Rights Act affords and covers, right? It affords protection to religious groups that are being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. Now, last December in 2019, President Trump issued this executive order on combating anti-Semitism. And what he did is, first of all, he kind of strengthened these letters, because these were Dear Colleague letters. Now this became part of an executive order saying that this is our understanding of Title VI. He also expanded it so it's not just the Department of Education or the Department of Justice. It's now all government agencies that are covered by Title VI and that provide funding, government funding. But what he did, which was really new, is that he linked Title VI to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And he said, basically, when you are reviewing these complaints under Title VI, alleging anti-Semitism, alleging discrimination against Jews, and you want to understand what is anti-Semitism, going back to our whole discussion at the beginning of my presentation. So as I said, since many people don't understand anti-Semitism, they don't know what it is. They have a very narrow perception of what it is. They don't understand all the current manifestations of anti-Semitism, so they don't recognize sometimes some of what's happening on their campus as the anti-Semitism that it is. The Ihra definition is this guide. The Ihra definition is this tool. So the executive order was basically saying, look, now when it comes to these complaints, you have to understand and apply and interpret these complaints in light of the Ihra definition. And as I say, if, for example, many people don't know or don't realize what national origin discrimination against Jews is, right? Many people think that that's limited to Israelis, that national origin discrimination against Jews means I say I won't hire an Israeli. That's national origin discrimination. But that's not the only type of national origin discrimination that impacts Jews. National origin discrimination against Jews is also when you have Jews being marginalized and harassed and excluded because they're celebrating their shared ancestry and ethnicity, namely their Zionism. So the Ihra definition would be used so that universities would understand when they're looking to understand the intent behind anti-Semitic conduct, right? There are two pieces to it. One would be universities would use Ihra when they're trying to evaluate conduct, right? And understand if this is anti-Semitic conduct. If you look to the Ihra definition, then you can understand that this helps you understand the intent behind the conduct. It can also be used to just understand the anti-Semitic rhetoric, not to shut down, right? There is nothing in the Ihra definition that prohibits or precludes or in any way punishes or outlaws anti-Semitic speech. So, in the United States, Canada has its own hate speech issues, but in the United States, hate speech is protected speech. So there is nothing in the executive order that runs counter to the First Amendment. There is nothing in the executive order that suggests that we're going to penalize anti-Semitic speech. You have an absolute right in the United States to express yourself as a bigot. That is protected. And Ihra doesn't change that. It just labels you. You don't have a right not to be labeled a bigot if you express yourself as a bigot. And Ihra helps label those who are engaging in anti-Semitic rhetoric. That's all.
Okay. I wanted to actually move on to one of the questions from our Harvard students. And this actually ties into something that I wanted to congratulate you on, which is the Zivatovsky case. As of a couple of weeks ago, your victory there was complete. But when I first heard you speak, I think it was 2 years ago at a camera conference, you actually mentioned that you had lost that case, which led to some interesting follow-on effects. And I thought maybe you'd want to address that.
Sure. So you're talking about the Zivatovsky case. Some people call it the Jerusalem passport case. In a nutshell, to give those who aren't familiar with it a little bit of background, many people don't know that until very recently, the formal position of the United States, and I think other countries like Canada, it's probably still the formal position, is that Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem, we're talking about even the portion of Jerusalem that's been under Israel's sovereignty since 1948, the US did not recognize any part of Jerusalem as being in Israel. When the US formally recognized Israel in 1948, in deference to the UN and the original partition plan, which had envisioned Jerusalem as some international city, a corpus separatum, they didn't recognize Jerusalem formally as being in Israel. So the result of that, you could really see it clearly in the US passport policy, because the passport policy is that for an American citizen born abroad, born anywhere outside the US, their passport lists only a country of birth. It doesn't list a city. So for instance, you have two Americans and they're living in Paris and they have a child. That child's passport would say France, no city, just France. So for American citizens born in Tel Aviv or Haifa, their passport lists Israel as the country of birth. But for an American citizen born in Jerusalem, because the US position was that Jerusalem is a city with no country, they would list Jerusalem, a city, instead of a country. This policy, though, was not balanced, because the State Department would, and still does, bend over backwards to accommodate the interests of those who seek Israel's demise, who wish that one day there would be no Israel. So if you have, for example, an American citizen born in Haifa who opposes the existence of the state of Israel, so they don't want their passport to say Israel, which would be the default, they may request from the State Department that Israel be removed from their passport, and the State Department will acquiesce, they'll agree, they'll take Israel off, and they'll put the city on. Against the general rule, they'll list Haifa instead, let's say, or whatever the city is. But it goes further than that, because even though the rule, and this is a rule everywhere in the world, the rule is that the present sovereign is what has to be listed. The country with present sovereignty must be listed as the country of birth. So for example, I know somebody who was born in Kiev when it was part of the USSR. Now he has to list as his place of birth Ukraine, but he doesn't feel Ukrainian, right? He was the USSR at the time when he was born, and he never lived in it when it was Ukraine. But that's the rule. So his passport says he's Ukrainian. His passport says he was born in the Ukraine. However, for American citizens born before 1948, anywhere in Israel, so they could have been born in Tel Aviv or Haifa or Jerusalem, if they request it, the State Department will list Palestine as the place of birth. Clearly not the current sovereign over Haifa and Tel Aviv or any of these areas. And yet the State Department will make that accommodation too. So in 2002, what happened is Congress passed a law to try and correct this inequity. And what they said is that if a citizen born in Jerusalem or their guardians request it, then the State Department shall list Israel as the place of birth on that US passport. When this law passed overwhelmingly, right, it was mandatory. Somebody requests it, you have to list Israel. The default would still be Jerusalem, but if it's asked for, you have to list Israel. Even though it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, it was by a unanimous voice consent vote. When President Bush signed the bill into law, he issued a signing statement, and he said that he's not going to follow this section of the law. It was part of a bigger law because this section impermissibly interfered with his exclusive authority to handle the foreign policy of the US. And so shortly, 3 weeks after this law was born, a very good friend of mine, lifelong friend of mine, gave birth to her third child. This was a couple that had had 2 kids in the US, made Aliyah, moved to Israel. Their third child was born in Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, which is in the part of Jerusalem that's been in Israel since 1948. And I suggested to her that when she go to get her child's passport, that she request that it say Israel, which she did, and they were told by the clerk at the consulate then that it doesn't matter what this new law says, it's going to come back saying Jerusalem, which is what it did. Their child was Menachem Binyamin Zivatovsky, and I joke that that's when he became, my father and I have a law practice together, a father-daughter practice. He became Lewin and Lewin's youngest pro bono client. That was 18 years ago. And in the course of the 18 years, the case went up to the Supreme Court twice. It was very nice because my father got to argue it the first time. That was his 28th argument before the Supreme Court. And then I got to argue it the second time. That was my first argument before the Supreme Court. And as you said, my father won his round, which was on the procedural question about whether or not the court could even hear it. And then on the actual merits, deciding who has this recognition power. Is it Congress or is it the president? I was trying to argue that it was a shared power, right? Because I wanted to be able to say this law is constitutional, and Congress clearly had the authority to pass this law. I lost that 6-3, and the court decided that no, the president of the United States has the exclusive authority to recognize foreign sovereigns. It was not a decision that was anticipated. The truth is, all the groups, everybody was on our side in that Supreme Court argument. We had all 100 senators. That seems kind of a real dream today. You can't imagine all 100 senators being united on anything, but all 100 senators filed an amicus brief in support of our position. It was the Senate Legal Counsel's Office. There were additional congressmen who signed on. We had states attorneys general, legal scholars, the entire Jewish community from right to left, Orthodox, conservative, reform. Everybody was in support. There were three briefs that were filed on the other side. One was from the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. That was their first brief in the case. After 13 years, this was the first time. And they did that because the first time we were in the Supreme Court, we pointed out that the Arab community had never filed a brief in the case. So how important could this be to them? So they filed one. The second was a brief filed by a group called True Torah Jews, who are like the Neturei Karta, opposed to the current government of Israel. And the third was by a disgruntled taxpayer in California. So like I say, this was my first argument. I really thought we had the wind at our backs, right? And we would win this, and how we were right on the law, and how could we lose? But nobody anticipated a president quite like President Donald Trump, who then turned around and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and recognized the Golan Heights as being in Israel. And when he did that, he was exercising this authority that the Supreme Court of the United States had now determined was exclusively his. So whereas for pretty much everything else that our president has done while in office, there have been lawyers who have run into court to file for injunctions to block what he has said and done. And so he has hundreds of lawsuits filed against him. The number of lawsuits brought challenging his recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, or recognition of the Golan Heights as being in Israel, are zero. Zero, because our Supreme Court had already decided that he alone had that authority. So what happened, though, is after he made the announcement on the Golan Heights, the State Department changed the passport policy with regard to the Golan Heights. Believe it or not, before that, an American citizen born in the Golan Heights was required to list Syria as the place of birth on their U.S. passport. So that got changed, and now it was said Israel. But they didn't change the passports for Jerusalem. And the argument that was being provided by some of the career civil servants in the legal advisor's office at the State Department was that when President Trump had recognized Jerusalem, he had made clear and said that he was not predetermining the borders of Jerusalem. In other words, if there's going to be some settlement agreement and an ultimate peace agreement, he wasn't going to predetermine that. That was for the parties. And so they said, so what if we end up putting Israel on the passport of somebody who feels they're not born in Israel? But we already addressed that when it comes to even places like Tel Aviv and Haifa, we let people take it off. So that became an internal battle in the State Department that went on for a couple of years, honestly. And ultimately, 3 weeks ago is when finally they managed to negotiate a resolution to that and agree to what the law passed in 2002 originally said, which is that the default is still to put Jerusalem. But if an American citizen born in Jerusalem asks for it, that way you know you're only putting it on the passports of the people who want it, right? If they ask for it, the State Department must put not only on the passports, but also on all the consular documents. So birth certificates, death certificates, which do have both a city and a country. So those do say Jerusalem, comma, Israel. The passports just say Israel. Now, as of the end of October, all of those documents will, if you ask for it, say Israel. They will say Israel. And on October 30th, the Ambassador David Friedman, the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, presented at an official ceremony our client, Menachem Binyamin Zivatovsky, with the very first American passport that lists Israel as the place of birth for a citizen born in Jerusalem. And he turned 18 years old now, a couple of weeks ago. So it's an 18-year journey. But it taught me a lot. It taught me, number one, this case, to never, ever give up, to realize that even if you lose at the Supreme Court, it's not necessarily the end of the road. And sometimes what you think may be your greatest loss can turn into one of your most tremendous victories. So it is very exciting.
A huge victory for the entire Jewish people. I mean, I actually didn't know that they had accepted the Golan Heights before they accepted Jerusalem. This is, I don't understand. And this brings me to another question I have is, what can we do from maybe not a strict legal perspective, but for example, through the bar associations, through pressure on these organizations? Because for example, like you said, you can pass a law, you can win or lose at the Supreme Court, but if the State Department seems to want to do something else, how can we, pressure them to take correct, let's say, legal positions that support Jews in basic rights of self? I don't know a single other country that has, disputed territories where this happens. Kashmir or Tibet or Morocco with the Sahara. Like, how do we put pressure on these organizations?
I think, part of it is really getting people to understand that anti-Semitism and this kind of discrimination is a human rights issue. I mean, going back to the Zivatovsky case, when I argued the case in the Supreme Court, so there was a point at which Justice Sotomayor asked the Solicitor General of the United States, and she said, requiring the State Department to list Israel as the place of birth of an American citizen born in Jerusalem is asking the State Department to lie, isn't it? And I thought, lie? Like, that's a pretty strong word. And just earlier in the argument, there had been this set of questions which Justice Alito had at first asked me. He had said to me, tell me, when your client was born, did the U.S. give your client a birth certificate? Did Israel give your client a birth certificate? I said yes. And he said, did the Americans recognize the validity of the Israeli birth certificate? I said yes. He said, what about when somebody commits a crime in Jerusalem? Do the Americans recognize the Israelis' right to prosecute that crime? And I said yes. And so then he asked these same questions to the Solicitor General, who answered the same way, and who then said, look, for certain practical purposes, the U.S. recognizes Israel's sovereignty over Western Jerusalem, and then beyond that, it gets complicated. So I had said in response on rebuttal to Justice Sotomayor. I said, it's not a lie. I said, first of all, the Solicitor General just acknowledged that for certain practical purposes, the US recognizes Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. And second, that what you put in a passport is not the State Department speech, it's the individual speech. And she looked at me and she said, it is a lie. It's not Israel, it's Jerusalem. And I thought, that is where we were until 3 weeks ago, where people who were born in Jerusalem, who felt this very strong, deep connection to their ancestral homeland, who were very proud of the fact that they were born in Israel, who want to be able to say they are Israeli, they were being told by their government, no, you, in our eyes, you are stateless. You have no state. You have no right and no ability to claim that you were born in Israel. We will not recognize that. That to me, right? And that's, I would like to see other countries like Canada recognize how outrageous that is, to deny an individual who's born in Jerusalem the ability and the right to reflect on their document that they were actually born in Israel. That, I think, is discriminatory and is a human rights issue. And so I think that the more we're able to get the bar associations, the organizations, the human rights commissions to recognize that national and ethnic origin discrimination against Jews includes demonizing them on the basis of their celebrating their sense of Jewish peoplehood and the Jews' ancient connection to the land of Israel. There is one additional point. I mean, I don't know if you have another question, not totally related to this, but one other point that I would like to share because I think it's important. And that is, it's kind of unrelated, it's just I see our time coming to the end. That is, I think it's important, especially when there's this pressure sometimes and people suggest that Zionism is racism and Zionism. I think it's important for people to know that Zionism does not preclude coexistence, and it never has, right? The idea that somehow Zionism means erasing or cleansing, an area that's of Palestinians, that's not what Zionism is and has never been. Even, right, we're talking about the Zionism that's an integral part of Jewish identity, but even the political movement of Zionism never called for that. And there's a quote that I just want to read to you. Chaim Weizmann, who was the very first president of the brand new state of Israel, back in 1937, okay, so this is it's actually in the 20th Zionist Congress. So he was one of the leaders in the Zionist movement before the state of Israel was even created and then becomes the president of Israel. But in 1937, he says in a speech that he gave to the Zionist Congress, and I quote, "Permit me at this historic juncture to say a word to the Arab people. We know that the Mufti of Jerusalem," and then was another, that was Haj Amin al-Husseini, and then there was another Nazi collaborator who was named Fawzi al-Kaukaji, "are not the Arab nation. In the present world, those who have bombs and revolvers at command wield political power. But in the history of a nation, their life is like one day, even if it extends over years. There is an Arab nation with a glorious past. To that nation, we have stretched out our hand and do so even now, but on one condition. Just as we wish them to overcome their crisis and to revert to the great tradition of a mighty and civilized Arab people, so must they know that we have the right to build our home in Eretz Yisrael, harming no one, helping all. When they acknowledge this, we shall reach common ground, and I hope for the time when we shall once more recognize each other." So it's 80 plus years since that speech. And the Jews are still asking for the very same thing. We just want the understanding that we too have a right to build our homes in Eretz Yisrael. Once there's an understanding that there's a place for you and for me, we can work together. Nobody's suggesting that Zionism precludes coexistence.
Okay. I have some more questions, but I don't know how we're running for time. Do we have time for a couple more, David? 2 more. Okay. To turn to some a little bit less from the public side, maybe. I have a question from the Harvard Jewish Students for Israel. You're both a law firm partner and general counsel of the Brandeis Center. How do you balance the private and public interests of your career?
It's a constant juggle. And you say the public and private, I honestly don't believe there's such a thing as a work-life balance. It's never balanced. And you do the best you can. I don't sleep very much. I am in desperate need of sleep and in desperate need of more hours in the day. The truth of the matter is, though, I have to say that the work that I'm doing now and the ability at the Brandeis Center and through the law firm to be able to focus on these kinds of activities, particularly the time that I get to spend working with students and helping students, is enormously personally gratifying and rewarding. And so it gives me energy. It gives me energy.
That actually brings me to another question, is how do students get involved? Either through the Brandeis Center, I see a lot of future law students here, or future lawyers asking for how to get more involved with the Jigsaw initiative. And, yeah, go ahead.
If you're interested in Jigsaw, again, send an email to that info@brandeiscenter.com. The things that we would need from you would be a cover letter explaining your interest, your resume, your transcript, and a writing sample. And then we can evaluate that and get back to you as we're putting together the next class of Jigsaw Fellows to be trained. So I'd love to hear from you.
And one more question, I guess, is what's in the future? Are there any pending cases now that the Brandeis Center is working on? Or what like, especially now that we're having a transition to a new government that might not be quite as favorable to Jewish issues, but we have a Supreme Court that's quite new in composition as well. What's the legal landscape looking like for the future?
So I'll answer that on a few levels. Number one, in terms of the Brandeis Center, one case that it has now just recently become very public and is something that we'll be working on is at the University of Illinois in Chicago, in Illinois. I mean, actually not Chicago, but in Illinois, and at UIUC. And we were very gratified earlier this week when the chancellor at UIUC issued a joint statement with the Jewish community recognizing the seriousness of the problem, recognizing that Zionism is an integral part of Jewish identity and that students on that campus have to be protected and able to express that safely, recognizing essentially Natan Sharansky's 3Ds, that anti-Semitism incorporates the demonization, delegitimization, implying a double standard to students, and then laid out a couple of first steps that they wanted to take, including the creation of a council, a Jewish council to kind of advise on this that would include students and faculty and some community members, including that they will institute training, educational component, and that they would review their own policies to make sure that they are set up to protect these students. That was a great first step. And we now realize that now the hard work comes, because now we have to convert those words into action. At the same time, we had filed a Title VI OCR complaint with the Department of Education. We filed it back in March. It was a very long, detailed, complex complaint. It actually included incidents that went back 5 years. So it took a considerable amount of time for OCR to review it before even opening their formal investigation. They just opened that investigation last week, and so they'll also be looking into this. So that is one. I think that's a campus that, because of the intensity and history, is a model of one of the most difficult campuses in terms of the experiences of Jewish students there. On the other hand, I think it could now, because of this, and I hope ultimately become a model of the solution to the problem. I'd like to be able to see us work with the university to come up with real concrete steps that will make a real difference to the students to the Jewish and prosel students on that campus. So I'm optimistic about that. In terms of the future and the next administration, It's important to remember, as I said, that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, protections for Jewish students is something that both Republicans and Democrats, right, have recognized. So I think that understanding and interpreting Title VI as applying in these situations should be something that a future administration should also understand. And the truth is that even though it was President Trump who issued the executive order, the Ihra definition was issued by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. 6 years earlier, in 2010, President Obama's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, that's a position at the State Department, actually adopted and posted on the State Department website the State Department's definition of anti-Semitism. That definition ended up being kind of a precursor, an early model, a version of what became the Ihra definition. So the actual kind of black letter language of the definition itself is identical to the Ihra definition. And then the State Department definition gives the same 11 examples that are provided in today's Ihra definition, but they're grouped differently because the State Department definition was working off of Natan Sharansky's 3Ds. So it actually grouped the examples as, here are examples of demonization, here are examples of delegitimization, here are examples of applying a double standard. But the content of those examples is basically the same. So the idea of using this definition and recognizing that this is the definition of anti-Semitism, that this is how we understand how anti-Semitism manifests itself today, it's the same definition that was used by Democrats as well as Republicans. So I should hope that everyone says combating anti-Semitism is apolitical. It's bipartisan. It's not something that just one party believes in. And the truth is, the Jews, unfortunately, the extreme right and the extreme left hate each other, but the one thing they agree upon is they all hate the Jews. So the Jews are in the crosshairs. And so the hope is that whatever our future brings, we'll be able to count on the government to recognize the problem and hopefully address it.
I know today, I think this morning, the current outgoing administration actually declared that BDS they're going to view officially as anti-Semitic as well. Is that going to have any interesting ramifications?
It will be interesting to see. I think, the core and the crux of the BDS movement is anti-Semitic. Not everybody who follows or is a BDS proponent is anti-Semitic, but for those who established it, for those who created it, its ultimate goal is really the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And you can look at the three demands of the BDS movement and see that. Because if you look at what the three essential demands of the BDS movement, you can check it out on their website, are. The first is what they say: end the occupation and take down the wall. So if we assume that what is meant by the occupation is just the territory that Israel acquired in the 67 war, so the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So if the idea is that Israel's supposed to withdraw from that and take down their security barrier, presumably so that there'd be a Palestinian state created in that territory. The second demand is that all Arabs and Palestinians in Israel proper, in the 1948 borders, should be given equal rights. But Arabs in the 1948 borders have equal rights. That's why the Arab Party is the third largest party in the Knesset. They vote, right? That's why you have Arabs who are lawyers and doctors and judges and all the different professions. You have justices in the Supreme Court who are Arab. The dean of the Hebrew University Law School is an Arab. You have doctors who are Arabs. They do have equal rights. So why do you have to repeat that? The reason for repeating that as the second demand is the third demand. The third demand is the right of return of all Palestinian refugees. So Palestinian refugees are treated differently than any refugee group in history, whereas the term refugee for all other refugee groups has applied only to the individuals who actually left their homes and not to any successive generations. The Palestinians are the only group where the term refugee has been applied not only to those who left their homes in 48 or 67, but also to all subsequent generations. So the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. So whereas there might be from 1948 a couple of tens of thousands of refugees alive today, the number on the BDS website is, I think, either 7.25 or 7.5 million Palestinian refugees. And the demand is that all of those 7.5 million refugees must be able to return to Israel proper, to the 1948 borders, not to become citizens of this state of Palestine, but to become citizens of Israel proper. The idea there is that then, if they all have equal rights, they will very easily and quickly change the demographic of Jewish Israel so that it's no longer a Jewish state. And people like Omar Barghouti, who's one of the founders of the BDS movement, has said that explicitly. He said, if you have the right of return, there'll be no more Israel. There will just be a Palestine next to a Palestine. And so that is really the ultimate goal of the BDS movement, is not coexistence. It's only coexistence at the expense of Israel's Jewish sovereignty. We should all live together, but we should erase Israel as a Jewish homeland. And as I mentioned in my remarks, if you erase Israel as a Jewish homeland, that is that's problematic. That's anti-Semitic. That's immoral, and that is one of the problems with the BDS movement. It's not seeking a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. It's seeking just a Palestinian state.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. So again, we've put the information for the Jigsaw into the chat if anybody's interested in applying and being in touch.
You know what? I have one more thought just before you end it, because I think it is something that's important for students on campus and it relates to BDS. I think that if you look at the Abrahamic Accords and you take a look and you see that what's happened now today is there's a clear divide in the Arab world about what is the best way forward for peace and prosperity, even for the Palestinians. Is it to boycott Israel? Is it to refuse to normalize relations with Israel? Or is it to engage with Israel? And what the Abrahamic Accord showed is that you have countries like the UAE and Bahrain that have said, you know what, we're canceling our BDS, right, our boycott laws. We want to engage with Israel. We want normalization of relations with Israel. That's the way to peace and prosperity. That's the way to ensure the best lives for the Palestinian people. And on the other side, you still have those who say, no, we insist on BDS, we insist on boycotting Israel, we insist on anti-normalization, we will not normalize relations. Who are those groups? That's Hamas, that's Hezbollah, that's Iran. Those are groups that are not seeking coexistence, right? The groups that are seeking coexistence are the UAE and Bahrain. The groups that are seeking to just wipe Israel off the face of the earth and destroy Israel as a Jewish state are the ones that are still pushing boycott and anti-normalization. Now comes the time for the Palestinian Authority to choose. And it's the same thing with students on campus here. Are you going to seek coexistence? Are you going to seek engagement? Are you going to seek to work together with Israel to better the lives of everybody in that region? Or are you going to side with the terror organizations that are opposed to Israel's very existence and who are continue to push for boycott and anti-normalization? Now you can close up.
So first of all, I wanted to thank you for all your work for Jewish students and Jews in general around the world. Both, I think, any efforts in that direction are, whether they're ultimately successful, like your passport case or your prosecution of universities, I think you do a great service for the Jewish people, and I want to thank you. Again, anyone who wants to get in touch with the Brandeis Center, the application for the Jigsaw Fellowship is in the chat, and I think we can post it on the Facebook event afterwards as well. And I hope that you bring it to Canada soon. We could really use some backup here, some big guns in the fight. And if there's any questions, can people reach you, social media or other ways?
The best way is if you send that email, as I said, to info@Brandeis Center, it will get to me. Brandeis Center, info@brandeiscenter.com is the best way to connect with me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lewin. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And I want to thank also the Harvard Jewish Students for Israel and the Hasbara at York, who helped co-host and organize this event. Obviously, David, Camera, you guys have been great helping us put this all together. So that's it. David, you have anything to add?
Thank you all. This has been amazing. I want to thank you all for your time and thank all of our participants for participating from Q&A. And I hope everyone has a great day.